Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending our workshop today about trauma-informed classrooms. We are going to explore today how trauma impacts students and what it means to create a trauma-informed classroom. We're not here to label or diagnose, but to learn how to make classrooms spaces that are safe, predictable, and compassionate. My name is Leslie Shu, and I am a registered provisional psychologist from Con Communication Services. And as we gather here today, we acknowledge we are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place, and we continue to reaffirm our relationship with one another. Just a quick overview about what I will be covering today. We're going to start off with understanding trauma. Then we're going to look at recognizing symptoms of trauma in the classroom specifically. Then we're going to talk a little bit about practical trauma-informed strategies. And lastly, I just want to touch on what it means to actually sustain a trauma-informed approach long term. So to start, we're going to go through and talk a little bit about understanding trauma. So many children carry experiences of trauma, whether it is a single event, some ongoing stress, or even long-term instability. And this might include things like family conflict, loss, exposure to violence, poverty, or other overwhelming experiences. These experiences shape how children learn, behave, and relate to others in the classroom. And so it can affect things like concentration, memory, self-regulation. It can actually also make students more sensitive to stressful environments and less trusting of adults and peers. And so often it's parents, caregivers, teachers, support staff, and service providers who see the effects of trauma first. And so before a formal diagnosis is ever made, we might notice a child who startles easily, avoids certain situations, lashes out unexpectedly, or even withdraws from others. And so the goal is today to raise awareness, share some practical strategies, and most importantly, to shift our perspective. So instead of asking, what is wrong with this child? We begin to ask, what might have happened? Or what might have this child experienced? And how can I meet them with empathy and safety rather than judgment? So, this perspective doesn't just support children who have experienced trauma, it actually helps create classrooms as well as communities where all students actually feel safer, more connected, and ready to learn. So, let's start with some of the basics. So, what do we mean by trauma? What is it? So, at its core, trauma is an experience or a set of experiences, a number of experiences that overwhelms a child's ability to cope. So it's not actually just about the event itself, but about how the child perceives and experiences it. So two children can live through the exact same situation. For example, let's say a house fire or a parental separation, and one may adjust and recover quite well, while the other experiences lasting impacts. And so the difference often lies in the level of safety, stability, and support that the child had during as well as after the event. I do want to talk about types of trauma, as there are three main types that we talk about. So there's acute trauma. This typically comes from one singular overwhelming event. For example, a car accident, maybe a natural disaster, a sudden injury, or a witness to a violent incident in the community. And these events are, of course, shocking. And while some children recover with support, others may actually develop things like ongoing anxiety or avoidance tied to reminders of the event. Next, we have chronic trauma. So, this actually develops through ongoing stress or repeated exposure to harmful situations. This can be things like long term bullying at school, repeated medical procedures, neglect, or growing up in a home with ongoing conflict. And so the constant stress of these events wears down the child's sense of safety and keeps the body in this prolonged state of just being very alert. And then we have something called complex trauma. So, this refers to multiple or even what we say layered traumatic experiences. And these often begin in early childhood when the brain is still developing and it continues to occur over time and across several situations. So, examples can be instability in the home, repeated losses of caregivers, exposure to continued abuse, or living in continued unpredictable and unsafe conditions. And so complex trauma has the most profound impact on brain development, relationships, as well as the child's ability to just trust and regulate emotions. So when we hear the word trauma, our minds often jump to abuse or neglect or violence. And of course, those are major causes of trauma, but it's also broader than that. Trauma can also come from a sudden loss of a loved one, family instability, such as divorce or even parental mental health struggles, ongoing uncertainty around basic needs like housing, food, or safety. Even repeated medical emergencies or procedures can feel traumatic for some children. And so the point is, trauma is not only about those extreme headline making events. Everyday stressors, when they are happening all the time and children are being left unsupported, can have just as deep of an impact on a child's development and their nervous system. What trauma does is it keeps our nervous system on high alert. So even when the danger has passed, the child's body and brain acts as if it can return at any time. And so this, what we call survival mode, can show up in classrooms in ways that are often misunderstood. So maybe a kid who is acting out may actually be protecting themselves from what they are thinking is a perceived threat. A child who might seem anxious maybe is scanning the environment for danger. A child who has shut down or actually looks very disengaged might actually be frozen in overwhelm. And so these are not signs of bad kids. What they actually are is their survival strategies. It's the body's way of staying safe when the world has felt unsafe and there's been no one there for them. So trauma is not just about what happened to a child, it's also about what happened inside them. And when we understand the types and impacts of trauma, we can start to see behavior through a new lens, one that emphasizes empathy and support. So, as I mentioned, one of the major causes of trauma is child abuse. So, I wanted to just spend a little bit of time going through the types of child abuse and kind of what to do in the event that that is raised in a classroom, at home, in a service provider meeting, anything like that. So, when we talk about the types of child abuse, we have physical abuse. And this is considered the application of unreasonable force by either an adult or a youth to any part of a child's body. So, for example, it can be slapping, hitting, physical discipline that is beyond what is acceptable. So, something I always like to mention here is spanking is not illegal. However, spanking has parameters around what that looks like. Physical abuse can also be things like pushing, throwing, hitting with a hand, punching, kicking, biting, hitting with an object, stabbing, choking, burning, poisoning, or use of restraints excessively. It also actually includes threatening to use any of these behaviors as a form of punishment. When we look at sexual abuse, so this is the involvement of a child by either an adult or a youth in an act of sexual gratification or exposure of a child to sexual contact, activity, or behavior. So this can be things like penetration, attempted penetration, oral sex, fondling, sex talk, voyeurism, and sexual exploitation. When we look at neglect, this is the failure of a caregiver or adult in the child's life to provide the physical and psychological needs of life. So, example, failing to supervise, which then leads to physical or sexual harm, allowing criminal behavior, physical neglect, medical neglect, or abandonment. We also have emotional harm, this is the behavior that harms a child either psychologically, emotionally, or spiritually. So this can be hostile or unreasonable and abusive treatment, verbal abuse, which can include things like threats, insult, and emotional neglect. Lastly, there is exposure to family violence, which has been separated from emotional harm as a separate type of maltreatment to a child. So in Alberta, this falls under the Child, Youth, and Family Enhancement Act as witnessing any violence within the home or other trusted environments is grounds for maltreatment because it can cause what they call an emotional injury. So, for example, allowing a child to see, hear, or be exposed to any signs of violence. So I did want to include a couple of points here following up from that previous slide about what to do if a child or a student discloses to you or staff about any form of abuse. So when we talk about disclosures, there are many, many, many reasons why children don't tell. And this can include things like maybe they love the person that's hurting them, they might have been groomed, they might have actually been threatened, and sometimes they actually don't even understand that what is happening to them may not be appropriate because it's something that they're used to or it's something that they've been told is normal. And so the first thing is it's so important to listen and control your reaction. I understand that it can be extremely difficult to hear a disclosure. However, children sometimes have the belief that they are responsible for your reactions and how you might feel. So, for example, if a child discloses something to you and you burst into tears, they may think that they did something wrong and that you're mad at them. And so part of that is validating and never communicating blame. So we want to be mindful that it doesn't matter your age. Nobody is asking to be abused. And for a lot of our children and teenagers, their prefrontal cortex development, so that front part of the brain, is not developed. So a lot of those higher order thinking skills, problem solving skills are not there, and they don't understand the severity of certain incidents. And one of the things too is that even though we're validating, we want to make sure we're not making any promises. So we want to say, I believe you, but we cannot promise, for example, that that person will get in trouble, that they'll never see them again, that they might go to jail. We can't promise that we might find the person. Unfortunately, the only thing you can do is listen and validate. Reporting is something that needs to be done, and I will talk about that in the next slide. And then self-care. So whether this looks like debriefing with, your principal, your spec ed coordinator, a colleague, a therapist, even just finding some time for yourself, as disclosures can be very difficult to hear. So it's also important to keep in mind that, when and if a child discloses any information to you and you feel like it's enough to report, please remember to only ask as many details as you need. And so I know in the moment it can feel helpful to try to relay as much information as possible, but what actually happens is it can be extremely re-traumatizing to have the child share this story over and over and over again. So there's a reason for child advocacy centers, there's a reason for individuals in police force that are specifically trained to speak to children, and this is one of the main things that's been brought up is that we don't want to re-traumatize our children when something so traumatic has already occurred. So as I mentioned, under something in Alberta called the Child, Youth, and Family Enhancement Act, anyone that believes that a child is being harmed must report to CFS, which is Children and Family Services, or the police. And so we actually have a duty to report in Alberta. So anyone that has what we call reasonable and probable grounds to believe that a child is either being abused or neglected must report. So this duty actually applies to everyone, not just teachers, doctors, professionals, neighbors, friends, extended family. We all have the duty to protect children. And so as I mentioned earlier, you don't have to have what we call full evidence, but just having enough is enough to report. And so NACIS is a great line to call to consult. There is also a CFS anonymous line if you are unsure and you want to just give some information and they will let you know. And there's also the child abuse hotline. And so this is another tool to use as well. So that kind of comes to that question of when to report. So it's a murky area because, as I mentioned, when we think back to all the different types of child abuse, they all have means and grounds if we believe there is. And so remember, we are reporting what we have. We are not collecting evidence. That's not our job. And again, it can be re-traumatizing. There are trained professionals who will do that. Your job is just to make the call and go from there. And so trauma doesn't actually just affect emotions, it actually does change how the brain functions in real time. And so we have something in our brain called the amygdala. This is our brain's alarm system, and its job is to essentially sense danger. When the amygdala senses danger, it flips our body into what we call survival mode. So this activates the fight, flight, or freeze response, and it floods the body with stress chemicals such as adrenaline and cortisol. And so when this survival system is turned on, the front part of our brain, that prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, usually does like attention, problem solving, planning, self control, it goes offline. It completely shuts down. And so that's why students who are triggered by trauma may look distracted, explosive, or completely shut down. It isn't that they won't focus, it's that biologically they cannot in that moment. I always say, think, if you are hiking and you suddenly see a bear, you're not going to be thinking about math problems or the next trigonometry question. You're thinking, how can I survive and get out of this? And that's what happens for our students in the classroom. And so, as I mentioned, in survival mode, the brain is not prioritizing learning, it's focused on safety. So, when a child can't remember instructions, loses control of their emotions, or they can't engage, it's biology. What their nervous system doing is exactly what it's designed to do. It's to keep them safe. And so we can't reason or discipline a student back into thinking brain when they're in survival mode. I always say things like logic or consequences, they don't work when the alarm system is just blaring all day long. And so the first step is always to help them feel safe and regulated. Then, when the prefrontal brain, the learning brain, comes back online, then we can start to go into some other tools. And so, again, think of the amygdala like a school fire alarm. So, it's designed to protect us by going off when there's danger. But for children who have experienced trauma, it's as if this alarm is hypersensitive and it's constantly going off, sometimes even when there's no real fire. So the body and the brain will just respond the same way every time. We either fight, we run, or we shut down. And just like in a school, when the alarm keeps blaring, the rest of the school cannot function. In the same way, when a child's alarm system is constantly triggered, the thinking and learning parts of their brain can't do their job. Until we can turn that alarm off, it doesn't matter how great the lesson is, it doesn't matter. The brain is focused on survival. This also has what we call developmental impacts. So if the survival system is constantly being activated in childhood, as I mentioned, the amygdala becomes oversensitive, almost like an oversensitive smoke detector, quick to react, hard to turn off. And so then what ends up happening is the prefrontal cortex actually gets less practice regulating and staying online. It's why some students live in a almost constant state of hypervigilance. They're always scanning for danger. The good news is that the brain is plastic. It can change, just like how repeated trauma can rewire the brain for threat. Repeated experiences of safety, regulation, and connection can help rewire it for calm. So, as the adults in these children's lives, our ability to stay calm, our ability to provide predictable routines and supportive relationships quiet that alarm system down. And so, over time, students learn that not every sound means fire, and their brain can start to actually learn and trust safety again. Trauma safety Trauma sensitive teaching isn't actually about lowering expectations. It's about recognizing when the survival brain has taken over and how to help the learning brain come back online. And so, how do we start to recognize trauma in the classroom? Before we talk about specific trauma responses, let's just pause and consider the bigger picture of how trauma can actually affect learning in the classroom. So, students impacted by trauma may have difficulty focusing or remembering instructions, not because they're careless, but because their brain is very busy scanning for safety. So, when the nervous system is on this high alert, energy that's supposed to be going towards listening or learning is actually instead used to monitor the environment at all times. Am I safe? Who's around me? What might go wrong? Where's the emergency exit? Where can I hide? Transitions and unexpected changes can also feel very overwhelming. So, a change in schedule, a sudden noise, even being asked to move seats can sometimes feel destabilizing. And these moments can trigger really big reactions yelling, running out of the room, shutting down completely. And it looks like an overreaction, but what's actually happening is the nervous system is trying to cope with the unpredictability. Being sensitive to feedback is also another common thread. And so, for many trauma impacted students, even gentle correction can feel threatening. A simple red X on the paper or a reminder to sit down might actually be interpreted as danger, right? And it's going to trigger that fight, flight, and freeze response. What we feel like might be mild feedback may actually be deep criticism or rejection to these students. Relationships can, of course, be impacted. So, peers may see these students as moody, unpredictable, aggressive. Teachers may feel frustrated. One day the student is engaged and cooperative, the next they're withdrawn and defiant, right? And inconsistency is important to remember. So, trauma affected students are not choosing actually when they want to engage and when they want to disengage. So their nervous system is just constantly in this shifting mode of learning mode, survival mode, learning mode, survival mode. And so on Monday, their brain may be very calm and they're participating fully. But on Tuesday, a small trigger might actually flip them into survival mode and now learning feels impossible. This is the reality of trauma in the classrooms. We have uneven engagement, strong reactions, behaviors that are easily misunderstood without a trauma informed lens. And so when we only look at the behavior, we sometimes label these students as lazy, defiant, difficult. But when we step back and we actually view it through trauma, we see something very different. We start to see that a child is just doing their best, trying to manage a body and a brain that are constantly living in survival mode. So, of course, trauma does not look the same for every child in person, and that's sometimes what makes it tricky to recognize. I wanted to talk about just some of the responses you might see. There will always be more. This is not an exhaustive list. So, we see that sometimes students become hypervigilant. They might look like they're distracted or not paying attention, but really their nervous system is actually constantly scanning for danger. So, maybe a slammed locker or a raised voice can send them into a panic. There may be always on edge, they're easily startled. We see that others may respond with aggression or defiance. So they yell, they throw things, they storm out, they might even challenge teachers and authority figures. This is often the fight response. So their brain believes that they have to defend themselves. Then on the other end, we see withdrawal or complete shutdown. So students put their head down, they go quiet, or they just completely disengage. It might again be mistaken for a child being lazy, but it's a freeze response. So they're disappearing and blending into the background as a way to stay safe. Another common sign is things like troubles focusing and sitting still. So these kids might look really restless, inattentive, off task all the time, but actually their body is in this constant state of alert. And so it's prioritizing safety, it's prioritizing survival, not the homework that's in front of them. We sometimes can also see perfectionism and a fear of failure. So these students may erase their work repeatedly, avoid handing things in, crumple up their papers 1,000 times before they bring you something, or they melt down over a small mistake. And it isn't about them wanting to be neat. It's sometimes a fear that any imperfection may bring criticism or rejection. And finally, we see emotional reactivity. So something very small, such as a group change, maybe a spilled pencil box, can actually lead to this very big reaction. And that's because their system is already overwhelmed. So we're just kind of the last thing that tips it over. And so the important common thread through several trauma responses is that they are meant to be protective. They are not on purpose trying to frustrate parents, caregivers, teachers, peers. These are just survival strategies. And in children who maybe didn't have people to teach them how to regulate, they're just trying to keep them safe in a world that hasn't always felt safe to them. So for me, this slide really captures the heart of trauma-informed care in one sentence. For so long, we've had schools and systems asking children, "What is wrong with you?" when they act out, shut down, struggle. And the question assumes that children are broken, they're defiant, or they're actually choosing to misbehave. The trauma informed lens flips that. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with you?" we ask, "What happened to you?" It's such a small shift in words, but a huge shift in mindset. It moves us from judgment to curiosity and from blame to empathy. So when we ask what happened to you, we see the child not as a problem to be fixed, but instead as a survivor who, as I mentioned, has developed various coping strategies. Even if these strategies show up in aggression, withdrawal, perfectionism, it actually helps us to meet the child where they're at to offer support as opposed to punishment. And so it's important to really note we're not excusing harmful behavior. It means that we understand the why so that we can respond in a way that actually helps the student grow instead of reinforcing these cycles of shame and fear all the time. So, these six principles from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is actually a US government agency that has set national standards for trauma informed practice. And so their framework has actually been widely used in schools, healthcare, and community programs around the world when it comes to understanding trauma informed care. And so these principles help to guide trauma informed systems. And in classrooms, this means things like creating safe routines, being transparent about expectations, building peer support, collaborating with families and community networks, empowering students to have voice and choice, and also being sensitive to cultural, historical, and gender responsiveness. So these principles are very broad, but they can translate into very concrete actions in school and the home setting that we'll go into. So, the first principle is safety, and it is the foundation of trauma informed care. For students who have experienced trauma, the nervous system is always scanning and thinking, "Am I safe here?" In classrooms, at home, in community programs, everywhere, in every environment, safety comes from predictability, routines, and environments where students can know what to expect. It also means creating emotional safety, which is knowing that they won't be shamed or called out for mistakes or even being punished when they're trying to regulate. So, when students can feel safe, their brains shift out of that survival mode into learning mode. And so, this is that first principle of trauma informed systems, and it's critical to calming the nervous system down and enabling trust. So, some examples of safety can be things like posting a visual schedule daily so the child knows what's coming next. Perhaps creating a calm down space for all students to use, which helps reduce stigma. Maybe it's kind of using predictable routines for transition. So, always giving either a 10, 5, or 2-minute warning before cleanup. Trauma often involves broken trust. And so, individuals who might have been unpredictable, unsafe, or absent in the child's life. And so, with this principle of trustworthiness and transparency, we're rebuilding trust by being consistent and transparent. So, this means following through on what we say, being honest about changes, and avoiding surprises when possible, right? Of course, this isn't always avoidable. So even small actions like previewing a schedule change can help students feel secure. And that transparency builds credibility and helps to reduce anxiety. And so, what transparency does is it restores that ability for children to trust adults and institutions, which is very essential after they've experienced trauma. So, some examples here could be if a routine will change. So, for example, every day we have these classes. Oh, but today we're going to have an assembly. Tell the student ahead of time. And you can say to the class, "Hi, everyone. I know block three, we usually do some spelling, but today we're going to be having an assembly." And you say that right at the beginning of the day. It gives the child some time to get into that routine. Be consistent in enforcing your rules. So don't change the expectations day to day because that can lead to very confused children brains. And it's also okay to admit your mistakes openly, saying things like, "Oh, I forgot to hand out that worksheet yesterday. Thank you for being so patient." This helps children with transparency and that stability. Next, we have peer support. So, peer relationships are some of the most powerful regulators. So, many children heal through connections with others their age. Teachers, caregivers, parents, service providers can promote peer support by actually creating things like cooperative learning structures, buddy systems, or even mentorship opportunities. This can also be part of community gatherings, community drop-in programs, and it actually doesn't just benefit students with with trauma. It actually creates a classroom culture of belonging for all types of learners. And so that peer support really builds resilience and models recovery through shared experiences. So, some examples here can be setting up a buddy system for new students so they're welcomed by peers, encourage cooperative learning groups instead of just competitive ones, and then facilitate peer led check ins where maybe some students can share about their coping strategies and so on. Next, we have collaboration and mutuality. So, trauma informed practice is not about doing things to students, but it's actually about doing things with students. So, working with students, not working on them. And so, collaboration means partnering with students in their own learning. It involves, including families, caregivers, working with colleagues, working with service providers as a team. It also means reducing power struggles. So we try to treat students, of course, in a developmentally appropriate way as partners in their own growth. They're not problems to be controlled and managed. And so the collaboration and mutuality acknowledges that healing relationships actually required shared power and shared respect. So some examples can be involving students in creating classroom agreements rather than posting rules day one that you've come up with. When discipline is needed, we can say, "How can we fix this together? How can we make this better?" We can partner with families and caregivers by asking, "What works well at home? I'd really like to try that at school. Share some strategies with me." Next, we have empowerment, voice, and choice. The biggest thing about trauma is it takes away control. And so in classrooms and at home, we can restore that by giving children voice and choice. Even small choices. Which pencil do you want to use? Who do you want to work with? Can help rebuild a sense of agency. We also focus on strengths, so recognizing talents, interests, skills instead of only the deficits. And so when students feel heard and empowered, they build resilience and confidence. Empowerment is essential for counteracting the helplessness that sometimes trauma can create. So some examples here can be, if possible, allowing a student to choose between two assignments. Would you like to do a poster or a written reflection? Invite students to share their strengths as well as their interests in projects. Give choices even in self-regulation strategies. Do you want to take a break in the calm corner or do you want to try a breathing exercise at your desk? Let me know. And the last one here is cultural, historical, and gender responsiveness. So trauma doesn't happen in a vacuum. So cultural, historical, and systemic factors like racism, poverty, colonialism, or gender-based discrimination all shape children's experiences. And so trauma-informed classrooms are sensitive to all of those realities, working to create spaces where every child feels seen, valued, and respected. And so it means using culturally responsive teaching practices, being mindful of how systemic inequalities actually impact behavior and learning. And so recognizing that these influences are there, it actually ensures that trauma-informed care doesn't repeat or reinforce these same harms and the same harmful messages that our kids are getting. So, for example, incorporate diverse books and materials that reflect different students' identities. Acknowledging culture and historical events that may impact students, for example, Orange Shirt Day in Canada for residential school survivors. Providing things like inclusive bathroom options and using preferred names. So, next, we're going to get into looking at some of the practical trauma informed strategies that we can implement in our day to day. So, we're going to start with classroom strategies, and they include a lot of structure. So, structure creates safety, and safety is the foundation of learning. So, as I mentioned, for students impacted by trauma, uncertainty feels very threatening. Predictability, though, on the other hand, tells the nervous system you're safe, you know what's coming next, you're going to be okay. And so when students feel safe, they're free to focus on learning instead of scanning the environment for danger at all times. So we can look at things like predictable routines and visual schedules. As I mentioned earlier, trauma affected students thrive when they know what to expect. Posted agendas, predictable routines, consistent classroom rules reduce the uncertainty that fuels anxiety. Even a simple support like a countdown timer for transitions, or even something like a first then chart. First, we're going to complete math practice, then we're going to have centers, gives children a sense of control. Think about how we as adults feel when we have to, when we have a clear agenda for a meeting. We're calmer, we're feeling better able to engage, and kids are no different. Emotional check ins. So, another way to provide safety is to give students tools for naming their emotions. So, emotional check ins like daily weather check ins, mood meters, color cards, or number scales allow students to actually communicate how they're feeling without having to find the perfect word. And so it helps them make their inner state very visible to teachers, parents, and staff. So a student who maybe quietly flips their card to yellow is giving you a chance to respond before things get to red. And over time, this practice can help students build self awareness as well as emotional vocabulary to be able to share that with you. We also have things like calm down corners and regulation spaces. So these are safe spots in the classroom or in the school where students can reset when they're feeling overwhelmed. So these spaces might have beanbag chairs, stress balls, coloring sheets, or even things like headphones. The important piece, though, about calm down corners or regulation spaces is how they are framed. They are not timeouts or punishments, they are tools. And the point of them is that we're communicating this is a place where you're safe. It's okay to take a break when you need one. And that reframing it for children makes all the difference. As I mentioned before, transition supports can actually help students move really smoothly between activities, classrooms, or even just settings in general. So, again, visual schedules, countdown timers, consistent phrasing, movement breaks, checklists, practice runs, even just adult proximity. So, being close during transitions to certain children can help reduce anxiety. And transitions are often the hardest moments of the day for children with trauma. And this is because they bring uncertainty. So, supports in these moments make the situation feel safer and more manageable to them. So, these strategies aren't extras or nice add ons, they're actually essential foundations for a trauma informed classroom. Structure communicates safety, and safety opens the door to learning. So when we can combine the predictable emotional check-ins, self-safe regulation spaces, we're again not lowering expectations, we're giving students the environment that they need to meet those expectations. So again, in classroom strategies, we look at relationships. As I mentioned, relationships are at the heart of trauma-informed classrooms. Students who have experienced trauma are often coming to school expecting to be rejected, punished, abandoned. And so by healing some of those expectations, it's not a single strategy. It's constantly showing up, it's consistently caring from adults who stay. And so, one of the first things we do is reframing behavior as communication. One of the most powerful shifts that we can make is to reframe behavior. Instead of labeling a student as defiant or lazy, we pause and we ask, what is this child trying to communicate to me right now through their behavior? A slammed book might be frustration, not wanting to join a group might be fear of embarrassment, Yelling at a peer might be a way of saying, I don't feel safe right now. And so when we interpret behavior through the lens of distress rather than disrespect, our response changes from punishment to support. Offering choices as opposed to ultimatums. So, trauma often leaves students with a very deep sense of powerlessness. And so, if every decision in their life has either been made for them or safety has felt unpredictable, they may push back hard against control in the classroom and in those settings. So, offering small, meaningful choices actually restores a sense of agency. Something as simple as, would you like to start with the odd or even number questions? Or do you want to present to me or to a small group? What these choices communicate to the child is you have some control here. And that sense of agency can really lower anxiety and reduce conflict. I also like to talk about daily connection rituals. So, relationships are built in small moments, they're not built in the grand gestures. So, greeting students by name, noticing their effort, or asking them about their interests communicates that they're seen and they're heard. There is a strategy here called the 2 times 10 strategy. It's a very powerful example. So, spending 2 minutes per day for 10 consecutive days talking to a student about anything not academic related sports, hobbies, family, TV shows, dolls, toys, etc. Research actually shows that this very simple routine dramatically improves behavior, trust, and engagement. Students are more likely to try when they feel like someone knows them beyond the schoolwork that they do. And finally, trauma informed classrooms emphasizes something called unconditional positive regard. This means separating the student from the behavior. Your behavior isn't okay right now, but you are still valued and I will still show up for you. And this matters because many students who have been impacted by trauma expect rejection or abandonment the moment they make a mistake. And so when we pull away in those moments, it actually reinforces their fear. But if we stay consistent and we show them, I'm not going to give up on you, that makes them feel safe. So in practice, for teachers, this can sound like, I can't allow you to shout, but I still want you here. So let's calm down and try again. For parents, it can be things like, I didn't like the yelling, but I love you. We will work through this. And again, students learn that their mistakes don't erase their entire worth as a human. And those relationships can stay steady even when behavior needs correcting. And so relationships isn't just a bonus in the classroom, it actually is an intervention themselves. So choices, daily connections, unconditional care creates the safety that students need to take academic and social risks. Strong relationships don't just feel good, they're actually protective, they're healing, and they provide foundations for learning. And so language is powerful. The words that we choose with students in their moments of distress can either escalate their nervous system or help settle it. So, for a child who has already experienced feeling unsafe, certain phrases can add fuel to the fire, while others act like water on flames. And so, we want to validate and connect as opposed to commanding. So, commands like calm down may sound logical, but they actually assume control. And for a child in survival mode, the loss of control feels even more threatening. So instead, a trauma informed language is about validating, inviting, and connecting. Instead of calm down, try, I'm here with you. Let's breathe together. Instead of, stop it right now, try, let's take a breath together. These small shifts communicate you're not alone. We also, again, reframe that behavior. So, another powerful shift of saying, what's wrong with you to what happened to you, right? This simple change reframes behavior as communication. And so, if a student has a big reaction, rather than saying, that was really disruptive, you might actually want to say, whoa, that was a really big reaction. Do you want to talk about it? And we can even say things like, oh, that looks really hard right now. Let's figure it out together. This tells the student, I see you're having a really tough time, but you're not a bad kid. And that distinction builds trust. And so down here, I just wrote words that validate. And so when we put labels on on our students like lazy, attention seeking, problem child, they stick. And our students internalize them. And so trauma informed language avoids these labels and instead actually describes what we see, right? So trying things like, I notice it's hard to get started on this. It looks like your body needs a break. This seems frustrating. How can I help you? When we name the struggle instead of the child being the problem, we keep the focus on the child and not, or sorry, we keep the focus on the challenge, not the child. And so trauma informed language doesn't mean, again, that we excuse unsafe behavior. It actually just means that we set boundaries to reduce threat and keep the relationship intact. Here's some examples. I can't let you throw things in the classroom, but I'll stay with you while you calm down. It's not okay to hit, but it is okay to be upset. Let's find another way to show and express that. We're still keeping our boundaries firm, but the language helps to lower the alarm system in our children. And so these small language shifts can have big impacts. Trauma informed language validates instead of shames, it connects instead of isolates. And the words that we choose really make the difference between escalating a crisis and actually creating a moment of trust and safety. And so I want to talk about sustaining a trauma informed approach. We cannot talk about trauma informed practices without talking about you, the educators, the staff, the service providers, the parents, and the caregivers who are on the front lines every single day. Supporting students who carry trauma is meaningful work, but it is also heavy work. And I really want to acknowledge that. When we listen to our students' stories, when we witness their pain, and when we manage their strong emotions day in, day out, it does take a toll. And that impact on the adult can sometimes be called vicarious trauma. And so when we begin to absorb and take in their stress, simply just from the repeated exposure of listening to it and listening to their pain and listening to their struggle. And over time, if we don't acknowledge this, it leads to something called compassion fatigue. And what that is it's the feeling of just being emotionally worn down. And it's hard to connect, it's hard to come to work. It even leads to things like burnout. And then that exhaustion makes it difficult to even show up at all. And so that is why self care matters. And so it's not a luxury, it is essential. Okay. This isn't about bubble baths or getting treats. It can be, but what it actually is it's about creating sustainable practices that protect your mental health so you can continue to do this important work. We talk about prioritizing boundaries. It's okay to leave work at work when you can. And saying no sometimes creates space for you to say yes to what matters the most. I know it's not always possible to say no, and there's so many things to do, and there's not enough hours in a day, but where can you say no? And where can you make that space for yourself? I also say creating regulation routines. So just like we're trying to teach our kids to have calm down strategies, we do too. Things like deep breathing before class, a short walk around the school at lunch, even jotting down some notes and thoughts at the end of the day can actually help really reset your system. Leaning on peer support and debriefs. So a quick debrief with a colleague, your admin, a spec ed coordinator after a tough moment can actually be really grounding. Having someone who understands makes you feel less alone. Of course, accessing any kind of formal support, so employee assistance programs, counseling, mental health consultations, they're there for a reason. And so reaching out is a sign of strength, not weakness. And modeling regulation for our students, right? It's something powerful. The way that we regulate ourselves in stressful moments actually becomes a model for our children. So when you respond with calm instead of escalation, when you borrow that, when you have that steady tone, our students actually borrow that. And so your choice to pause, take a break, communicates safety more strongly than any words can. And so in trauma informed practice, you are actually the intervention. Your presence, your consistency, and your ability to regulate yourself becomes the foundation for students to regulate themselves. So my takeaway is this: you cannot pour from an empty cup. taking care of yourself is never selfish. It's actually what allows you to keep showing up for your students and for our kids with patience, empathy, and consistency. And in the end, as I've mentioned throughout the whole presentation, consistency is what is healing. And so when you protect your own well-being, you're also protecting your students' well-being. And so summaries and takeaways. The good news is this: trauma-informed practices benefit every student, not just those with trauma histories. When we bring structure, predictability, and care into the classroom, we're creating an environment where all kids can feel safe, secure, and ready to learn. Safety is the foundation, and when that foundation is strong, learning thrives. Here's something else to remember. You don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. We are not expecting you to be a therapist in your role because the work that you do every day as educators, staff, parents, caregivers already carries so much healing power. Every smile at the door, every consistent routine, every validating word communicates to our kids, you're safe here. You belong here. And those small shifts really make a big difference. Swapping out the phrase like calm down for I'm here for you. Building in a 1-minute morning check in where students can show you how they're feeling. Offering a choice. Would you like to start with reading or writing today? Give students back a sense of agency. I know on paper these might seem like very minor adjustments, but for a child who is constantly feeling unsafe and hypervigilant and looking around not feeling safe, it actually can completely change how school feels for them. And sometimes it's actually the little daily interactions that a student remember the most. Students might forget the content of a math lesson, but they'll remember that their teacher noticed their new haircut, or that the EA sat beside them calmly when they were overwhelmed, or that the principal smiled and said their name in the hallway. These are the small moments of connection that actually tip the balance between fear and safety. And so if I leave you with one thing today, let it be this: relationships are the foundation. More than fancy interventions, more than strategies, more than programs, what heals is the consistent presence of caring and trusting adults. And so the way that you show up, even when students pull back, even when kids push back, is actually one of the most powerful interventions of all. And that's the thing that sometimes helps our kids start to believe, I am safe, I matter, I want to try again. And that's essentially what trauma-informed practice really is. It's seeing beyond the behavior. It's building safety through relationships and remembering that your support is important. And so thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for being the calm, the structure, and the care that you bring every day. For so many students, these really ordinary, consistent acts are actually extraordinary, and they do change their lives. And so on this slide, I've actually included some key resources if you'd like to dive a little bit deeper. So there's some things from practical classroom strategies to just actually the neuroscience behind trauma and understanding that. So the first one we see here is called The Whole Brain Child by Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson. So it's a very accessible book. It explains how children's brains develop and how simple strategies, things like naming their feelings or connecting before correcting, can support behavior and learning. So it's written with lots of practical examples for parents and educators. The next book that I have here is Fostering Resilient Learners by Kristen Sowers and Pete Hall. This is actually specifically designed for schools. So it focuses on how trauma actually impacts learning and then gives concrete strategies for creating those safe and supportive environments. And a lot of teachers actually find this book quite helpful because what it does is it blends the research with real world successful classroom practices. And then we also have The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. So this is actually a foundational text on trauma and the impact on the body and the mind. It's quite a bit more in depth and it is quite clinical, but what it does is it explains that trauma isn't just in the past. So it lives in the body, it lives in the nervous system, and it influences how people think, feel, and respond. And so this book really can highlight how healing happens through connection and safety and regulation. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you're not alone. There's resources, colleagues, and supports to lean on as we work together to make classrooms feel safe and like healing spaces. Just wanted to thank you all again for your time and listening to this workshop today. Just a final note, if you would like a summary handout for this presentation, we just ask that you email workshop@con-services.com. You'll receive a short survey, and once you've completed the survey, you actually will receive a link to the handout for this presentation. Again, I just wanted to say thank you for your time today.